So I'll give you just a moment if you haven't already soaked this in a little bit. This willingness to seek the truth rather than seek to be right. And a core part of seeking that truth in many ways is taking a systems-based perspective, really understanding the relationships amongst all the things, all the people at play in any one context or challenge or opportunity.
Yes. And so just for anyone who hadn't noticed, we knew we were coming right after Ose, who is an MC, right, and who is an amazing DJ. So Erik and I were brainstorming, what do we do to go after such a performance? So the only thing we could figure out was, let's make sure we match up, right?
You see the system here, right?
So that's sort of, I know it was subliminal, but we just wanted to point that out. It's all in the detail, all in the detail. So just as a brief sort of connect between facilitating change as a workshop and what we're going to do today is this belief that facilitation is a very core leadership skill, which I'm sure all of you agree as you are facilitators, but also a very, very important way in our view to really drive change. Facilitation of change is actually a core leadership skill. And we do believe that actually a big part of that is having a story that other people can buy into. So the workshop that we've designed is actually a workshop that helps tell your change story in a way that brings others along. And the 5 elements that are part of that are on the screen. The first is, what's my future vision? Very much connected to what we've heard just now, right? The future state. Can you articulate in a compelling way the vision that you would like people to buy into, right? So that's a core element of that. The second is, who am I and why do I care? The soil exercise we've just done is a way of doing that. Obviously, but there's multiple ways to try to understand who am I and why do I specifically care about creating this future. Why is that important? Because when you can touch others in a chord that touches their heart, very often it's because you share vulnerably why you care. So the notion of digging in personal mastery and understanding, this is why I care about this, is actually a way to connect to others. The third element is, where are we today? Which is bringing the state of play, or the current state, as we've just, again, today referred to. And this is the area that we'll dive into today, with the systems mapping. Then why should you care? We heard a lot about stakeholder mapping, convincing stakeholders. So why should you care is part of your change story, is identifying those important stakeholders and understanding deeply why do they care and how can I connect to that. To then, lastly, if you have mapped both the system and the stakeholders, you can identify high leverage interventions and make suggestions of what should be done. And if you would narrate those 5 topics in one go, you actually have your change story, by which you can, in a more confident way, convince others to drive the change with you. So that's sort of a little sort of setting on how we came up with facilitating change as a concept, and then within that, again, where are we today, this systems mapping is what we will dive into. And systems can sometimes be we hear a lot of people say it's a systemic problem, it's a system, but sometimes the word system or systems thinking can be a bit confusing or intimidating. And again, I assume many of you are familiar with it, but just to ground us in one of the definitions, and there's multiple ones, but Peter Senge is obviously the person that started the Academy for Systems Change, where both Erik and I went and met each other actually the first time. This is his definition. It's a framework for seeing interrelationships rather than things, right? Seeing patterns rather than seeing static snapshots. And it's actually very much looking at the space in between 2 things and the interrelation and the correlation between that. And so the problem statement, or the problem that we're going to address today and tomorrow, we actually are going to have a first exercise today on trying to see the interrelationships, right? Really trying to see the patterns rather than only the statements of what maybe is happening.
So a couple further ways to provide some context and why behind seeing things systemically are so important. And as Dirk mentioned here, we're oftentimes paying attention to that, the in-between, what's happening in connections amongst different relational pieces, because oftentimes when we're working with complex problems, which a lot of us are, in fact, most everything we talked about today is systemic, multi-layered here. And when we're talking about systems, there's oftentimes a delay, sometimes a pretty long delay between cause and effect, right? So anytime you may have gone to, say, quickly try to solve a problem that's actually systemic and find that actually your solution came back to you with something that's actually making the problem even worse, that's where understanding things systemically is really important, because there's this delay and a complex relationship between cause and effect. Give you a couple of quick examples here that hopefully are recognizable or familiar enough. So a couple basics here, and we'll tell you this multiple times because we see it a lot when we first introduce systems mapping to folks. The point of today is not creating a perfect systems map, all right? So we can geek out on this stuff, and it's interesting to dig into. Take what is helpful for you. The most important thing is that we are starting to better understand the relationships amongst a bunch of different things. So I'll give you an example here of a really common loop that oftentimes comes up when we're talking about systems. So feedback loops here can either be reinforcing or balancing. So an example of a reinforcing loop here would be like interest in your bank account, all right? So you have money in, interest is being accrued, and that continues to add money to that account, right? Okay. A balancing loop here would be an example of a thermostat, okay? So you have something set, a desired temperature, and ultimately there's a gap between the desired and the current temperature, and that then responds to balance things back out, to bring things back into a balance to what you have ultimately set here. And this plays out in a lot of different systems, whether things are reinforcing and continuing to grow, or ultimately trying to bring things back to some form of balance. In systems work, we talk a lot about system archetypes, because there's some pretty common ones that come up in complex systems. And one of those here being fixes that fail. So a good example here of where you ultimately try to implement a solution to fix a problem, and that solution ultimately makes things worse. All right, so an example here of the problem, maybe there's high interest on a credit card, for example, and an initial fix being to balance that out, we're going to take out an extra credit card to start paying on that. Uh-oh, we've got more interest coming. That creates more debt, more debt, more debt, and we ultimately don't fix the problem. And again, these play out in a lot of different ways across the systems in the different challenges and opportunities in our lives. Dirk's going to take this a step further here with some examples from Nike. So.
Yes, exactly. So about 3 years ago, in the job I'm in now, where I started that job, which was being responsible for sporting goods for EMEA. And the sporting goods industry, so basically Dick's Sporting Goods is, I assume, a retailer that many of you know. So you could think of the equivalent of Dick's Sporting Goods, but then in EMEA. And so I was handed over that team and that responsibility. And I started, it was the time that we were in these courses, so I used that new job to try to understand how can system mapping help. And I want to talk you to that one example, just to make it a bit more tangible and practical, rather than maybe the theory about archetypes, right? So what I found, and this is what we're going to ask all of you to do as well later, you just start to write down things that you notice. Not necessarily thinking about links between them, but what are the things that you notice? You know, when you start a new job or a new assignment, you just ask questions, you interview people, and you just start to, hey, that gets repeated. I'm going to note that down. And so basically, you ended up having things like, okay, there's low profitability. All those retailers have a tough time making money, right? That was one of the elements. For the sake of the time, we've put it straight away in a map today, right? So you will see how things are interlinked straight away. But there's another thing that I noticed, actually, was there was a lack of investment capacity, right? There was not, someone else was telling me, you know, they just don't invest in their stores, these retailers, right? They don't invest. But obviously, there's a clear link between if you have no profitability, you have very little to reinvest in your business, right? On top of that, they have very low digital capabilities, right? Again, linked to this lack of investment capacities. But the comment of low digital capabilities was a comment I got again from someone else, right? But if you map them, you can then see, well, if you have low digital capabilities, today consumers shop first on their smartphone. So if your websites aren't great, and if you're not really investing in digital capabilities, guess what? You don't attract the consumer. If you don't attract the consumer, you need to drive promotions to get people to your store, to bring them in. Now, if you can imagine, if you need to drive promotions, you have low profitability. So this is a typical reinforcing loop. Now then, as a company, we thought we were really, really smart, which happens very often if you're inside of a company. So what do? Actually, we say, wow, we need these retailers, so we're going to give them more discount. Because if we give them more discount, they're going to be more profitable, right? It seems quite logical. You know, they buy from you, you give them a higher discount so they can create more money. The thing that happened is actually, as a result, many of the retailers that should have gone out of business because they were actually not doing a proper job in serving consumers, they actually stayed in business. What's the result of that? Way too many competition. So what do? They need to promote to attract the consumer. So this is how you see, even if you have actually, you think you're doing something that makes sense, the moment I started to see, and this is only one very small section of the map that I created with my team, but just for sake of example, we realized we were doing this to ourselves, or we had a very big role that we played in keeping this system turning in a way that wasn't helping the overall consumer experience. Right, so it's by mapping, and all of these points that are on here came from different interviews. And then we did the exercise of mapping it. How is this linked? Because now it seems very logical when I tell this story in this way, but it wasn't when I started the role. So that's just an example on how that works. Yeah. So obviously, our role, or what we want to do with you today, is actually show how this process of mapping, and again, linking it to the Facilitation Summit, how as facilitators, we can have ways to map complex systems with a large group, actually, and get to insights that we maybe didn't have before doing this exercise. So obviously, the core question, how might we raise national awareness and adoption of the ACC digital fluency, micro-credentials and certificates for military spouses? That was the task, or the prompt that we were given by the organization we're working with, right? And so what we're going to do today is map what we know of that system, okay, as a collective. Any question before I hand over, or we're going to give a prompt in a second, but any questions on that intro first before we move to the next part? No? So I think we're first going to give the prompt, right?
Yep.
So the starting point is we're going to replay the video. It was called out this morning. We're very sure all of you watched the video. We're 100% sure. But just in case, or just as for your memory, we're going to replay.
Just a refresher.
A refresher. We're going to replay the video that was sent out. That is also at the same time your solo time. Right, so we were going to give you anyway solo time to reflect, so we're going to play the video at the same time. If you've seen it, feel free to jot things down. What's important is, based on what you're hearing or what you know about the situation, or based on the workshops we've done already this morning that gave you additional insights, write down things that you notice that you think are part of the system, of the issue. Important is to do one per sticky. So don't list them on one. We need one idea or one prompt or one thing you think is part of the system per sticky. Right? At the moment, don't try to find links in between. Just what you hear, note down what you think is important and relevant. okay? And from there we will go further. Yeah?
Cool. One thing I'd say here is you're diving in, because for many of you this is a new process. So I'll just tell you, if you're doing it right now, you're doing it right. Don't worry about creating a perfect map. Okay, the point here is that we're starting to think more systemically. All right, and that gives us an opportunity to then have a conversation together. Back to Danella's words, this allows us to build a collective truth together. Because then when that's out in front of us, we can make better decisions together. So just start, all right? And I'll keep coming back to that as a reminder. So I'm going to pop up a video here in a moment, actually from some of the research that has been done with these military spouses about their needs and the challenges that are coming up in their lives and accessing some of these resources. And you can just note as you're listening.
We were researching kind of how users currently find different resources on installations and what pain points that they may have been seeing. So we interviewed a lot of different people and surveyed several hundred more. And what we found was that people would just get stuff by word of mouth or via social media, and it wasn't always completely accurate information. We also talked to services, and we used that to inform the features that we decided to put in our MVP launch for My Army Post. So I think kind of the biggest thing that we learned was that there's not enough childcare providers on the installation to effectively provide childcare for every Army family. A military installation is ran by any of the military service, whether it's Army, Air Force, Marines, Navy, and it's where all of the buildings are that are the federal government property, and that's where all of the services lie for families to access. And that was where a lot of the issues come in, because it is cheaper on the installation for military families because it's a little bit subsidized. So if there's not a space for them on the installation, they have to go to off installation, which is a little bit more costly. And that's where there's a little, not a little bit of a gap, a large gap that makes it difficult for them to find careers as the family member. Something that is hard is finding those careers that can transfer to different places wherever we get stationed, and then building the community is hard. It's the longer you're in, kind of the harder it gets, I feel like. I think some of the things that we saw in our research and that I've seen is that we are pretty good at getting training for spouses or for service members that are getting out of the military, but most jobs now require experience. And where can they get experience if no one is willing to hire anybody without experience? We did actually, you facilitated a little exercise at our kind of fair. I thought that was an awesome program. And I thought that it could benefit a ton of people. And the main person that came to my mind was my mother, who is in her 60s and has a job that uses digital tools like Excel and Outlook, and I'm just her tech support, and she just calls me to get that information. But if she was able to get some sort of like micro credential that could help her understand it, whether it was actually getting that micro credential or just the knowledge, I think that could be very helpful, and I can see how that would be helpful to military families as they're moving throughout the states.
I also enjoyed it. I thought it was really, really cool, because I was like, well, maybe I could do some of these things, because some of those skill sets transfer to a wide array of disciplines. So you can use it for a lot of different things.
I think the biggest thing that we saw as a huge pain point was advertising. The Army doesn't necessarily have a large advertising budget to be able to market these different things. And so if ACC could take advantage of a way to market these better, I think that would reach a lot more people.
Like, for example, I was telling like Celeste, I was like, hey, did you know there is like a virtual internship for the federal government? So I did it for my master's program, and she's like, really? I was like, yeah, you really just have to be a student, and you apply at the U.S. Gov jobs, but then you get experience with a low-threat internship to the federal government, working for every almost every agency known to man. But if you can scaffold on that, and actually then like, well, I worked for the VA virtually, and then I'm going to apply for this job to build your resume up and say, hey, but I learned these skill sets along the way because I knew I was weak in some of these areas. Like I wasn't really good at spreadsheet management per se, or Excel, but through my internship and a program through ACC with building my digital literacy, I had another skill set. When I actually applied, I had somebody who would vouch for me as a reference, who's already works in the industry, and I have the skill to back it up. And I'm using veteran preference because a lot of jobs have that for spousal preferential like positioning, and to leverage all those things into one to apply for some of these jobs, I think could be super useful. And I think people underestimate how valuable like those small like state or federal like organizations actually have impact. There's a lot of job offers that come there. They say, hey, we need a public health person for the job fairs is so important. Even if you're not actively looking for an actual job, you'd be surprised what you can land on and what you can find that can kind of fit kind of the things you want to do by just asking people and just talking to them. I just think the whole scaffolding thing is the most important thing. So even if like after they do their micro certification, if there's a way for them to connect with companies, even for maybe just a week trial or 2 weeks, and to say, hey, just let me walk around and just intern and see what I can learn from just being here on ground. It's low threat to the company because you're an intern and they don't have to pay you, but it's also gives people experience and they build that bridge, and then of course targeting people who are like actively looking for people.
Nice to hear the voices of folks closer, right, to this challenge and opportunity. And I'm going to add a few more details here from another person very close to this challenge, who unfortunately we were going to be doing an interview, but unfortunately unable to be with us today, but I wanted to share her answers here with you. So just asked what they notice is going on right now in this problem and opportunity space in and amongst this challenge. And she said, unemployment has remained the top concern for military spouses, especially since military families relocate every 1 to 3 years. Right? And there's been a real shift in the working world post-COVID. Okay? Employers have moved a lot more toward remote work. And so that presents both opportunities but also challenges if you didn't already have some of those digital skill sets, right? I asked, why do you think things are working or not working at this point? And he said, this is a great opportunity for military spouses, especially for those that are looking for remote work. This allows them to focus on becoming more proficient in the digital skills they need in order to succeed in remote work environments. And finally, what elements of this problem and opportunity space do you hope we, all of us here, most focus on? She said, since unemployment is a top concern nationwide for military spouses, how can we get national military organizations to subscribe to the micro-credential digital skills program here at the college?
I was also at the Military Families Center ribbon cutting, and there's one thing I noticed that I thought might be helpful to share, which was a military spouse that had been invited to speak about her experience, and she said something that was quite, it made sense in retrospect, but never hearing it before, I was never exposed to it. But the fact that as she moved around with her husband on different deployments and to different installations, there would commonly be a really vibrant and strong and tight-knit military community that would be very supportive. So when they were to move somewhere, they would instantly have a lot of resources around them, and they could lean on that and learn to depend on it. But not all installations are created the same. And something that really was surprising for her when they came to Austin, because her husband is actually attending the software factory, which is the software boot camp for the Army. So these are active duty Army. They're learning how to be software developers and UX designers. And so he's attending that. They come here. Austin's very widespread. There's not a centralized base here. So everyone, while there is a vibrant community, it's very spread out, and it's hard to tap into those things. And that's one of the things the Military Family Center is striving to provide, is that hub, that central spot But she also spoke of, she first experienced it here, but there are other installations around that are more distributed, so that centralized nature doesn't exist. So that really spoke to me when I heard it. So I wanted to share that just in case it stoked any thoughts for y'all.
All right, thanks.
Yes, so we'll give you 1 more minute solo just after absorbing all of that, and then we'll go to the next section of that. So just 1 more minute to maybe finalize some of your thoughts, some of the things you noticed. So we would like to move to the next part, which is pairs. So at your table, we make it easy to start with. Just look at your neighbor and together share the stickies, the things that stood out for you. And you start to create, if you see connections between some of the things you do, you start to create a very small map in between the two of you on the table. So that's why we also ask to try to clean the table. So if there's still a lot on the table, just try to move that a little bit, right? We're using the resources that we have. And if you see connections, you can also use a sticky in between the 2 points to draw an arrow. So we're going to be creative here. So if you see a connection between 2 things, use a sticky to make the connection. So you get 15 minutes together to create 1 map with the 2 of you.
Okay, move yourself to a pausing point. And then please direct your attention back up here. If you're right in the middle of a sentence or in the middle of a question that you're still wrestling with, that's a great sign. Okay? That's the kind of conversation we are hoping that you're having. And if you're coming in to have figured this all out in the next 90 minutes, you're going to be disappointed. But hopefully, you have some new understandings and some better questions, and we have a better sense of those truths out there that we can operate with. So in a moment, we're going to shift to creating a group of 4. So pair will join a pair right next to you, and you're going to then be integrating both the maps that you've created. Okay? And it's going to feel a little messy. That's what this is. That's the work. All right? Now, and hold on one moment before, I know as soon as I said 4, it's all right, let's get going. Let's get a jump start. We can get the answer key down. This is going to be great. So as you move into your 4s, you're obviously going to have to integrate pieces. There's probably going to be some duplication, right? So it's like, yep, we've got this piece here. You can bring those together. This is similar. Do we want to bring those together or keep those separate? Also, too, this is the point, and I see some great examples here. We even have people tearing stickies to create arrows. It's fantastic. No, it's fantastic. So if you haven't already started to think about the nature of those relationships, start to draw those arrows. Which ones are particularly connected? Which one do you see maybe acting on another? Are there potential loops here? And again, it's not about perfectly identifying them. It's starting to surface the nature of those relationships. I'm going to share one thing that I always find really helpful when especially first engaging in this process here. So have a great colleague of ours in this space who has spent years doing systems work and systems maps. And so oftentimes, and we've asked, well, what's the step? And, are we doing this right? And what? And she always returns us to Darcy Winslow is her name, co-founder of the Academy for Systems Change. And oftentimes returns us to this quote from Alice in Wonderland in terms of the instructions for this. So as you're doing this, begin at the beginning and go until you come to the end and then stop. That's how to do it. So give yourself that grace. All right? Now move to your group of 4. We're going to take the next 10 minutes in your group of 4 to start integrating those maps and thinking about the nature of those relationships. Okay. Our final or almost final turn here. And again, the point is not to have these things absolutely complete, but as I'm listening across groups, it's fantastic to see the nature of the conversation, or witness the nature of the conversation. Each of you posing questions of one another. Well, here's how I see this. How do you see this relating to this piece over here? Or is this really like this, or should it be over here? Right? Again, co-constructing a truth and an initial map that then we can gather around and further merge together. Lily, did you have?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So really quickly, our group, I felt like at times, as we were trying to create our map, we were also thinking of solutions. And I was curious, should solutioning come into this first pass of mapping, or?
We're not solving, we're trying to understand, okay? So it's not that those solutions may not bubble up, but set them to the side for now, because we're not even necessarily clear on what the nature of the map is and the potential problem and opportunity space. So again, as is a hallmark of design thinking, and in a lot of the systems work, let's make sure we're solving the right problem before solving a problem, right? Because that can then, if we were talking earlier about again, those solutions or fixes that fail, you could end up doing something that then ultimately makes your problem worse. And we've seen that in a lot of complex systems-based challenges out there. Jimmy also asked in the back there about, should we be mapping just the things that aren't working, or the things that aren't working and the things that are working? Both. Okay, and in fact, I was mentioning back there, systems are working in the way that they were oftentimes designed, right? They're working. They just may not be working to do the things that we want them to do, right? And so that's where having the full picture, like, yeah, these things are working, they're working the way that we want, but that leads to these things over here not working. So let's get the full picture. Okay, our final turn. I'm gonna throw down the gauntlet here. It's 10 minutes. Now, you're gonna have a facilitator at your table. And here's how we're going to decide that. So whomever at your table has a birthday closest to today is going to be the facilitator for this final turn. Now, before you go to figure that out, here's what I suggest, all right? Quickly, have each group of 4 share briefly the story that's there. Okay, and then you can be starting to combine things. Oh, we have that. Let's get that in the center. And again, clear the table. I see so many drinks out here. I don't know. You're going to have things spilled. All right? So make sure you have space. In the next 10 minutes, facilitators, help your group come up with a collective table map. Go. Okay, move yourself to that pausing point, and I'll ask you to direct your attention back up to the stage here. Have a chance to hear from groups. I know it's at the end of the day, and it's so great to see people standing up around table. I mean, you're leaning in, right? No, this should go. No, I think this is actually the nature of this, and this is, for some of you, a challenge that hits so close to home. I know we have some military spouses in the room, people from military families, but also some of you, this is a problem that's not even that closely necessarily connected to you, and you're leaning in, you're building a sense of truth and surfacing something that people can work around, right? That starting point. Key thing that we didn't mention earlier, this process helps to surface what in systems mapping is called mental models. Those, it's kind of an internal ways that we view and order the world that until we oftentimes can externalize them in a way like this with our colleagues, it's a filter that we're not aware of, right? Or our colleagues aren't aware of. And so this gives us an opportunity to surface, well, here's how I'm seeing this. Okay, I'm seeing it this way. Let's bring that together so that we can collectively act. So I'd love to hear from a group or two, hopefully from everybody. And facilitators, you're particularly on the spot here. Would love to hear. I know you just did so much work on this. What did you notice as you facilitated this process? So there's a couple of different ways into this prompt. Either you could talk about the process itself, like here's what it was like to facilitate that integration of ideas, and here's what I noticed, and or wow, this new breakthrough surface. Like we didn't realize this one piece, and here's what we're thinking could be really important for us to think about tomorrow as we start moving to solutioning. So a couple different either process or content or breakthrough.
I'll be happy to go first. This is an awesome table because it's humbling to facilitate masterful facilitators because you all facilitate yourselves. And as somebody that's trying to step back and allow the dance to happen, what was really interesting is just understanding for ourselves, like what really is the place to start? Where's the beginning? And I think we have this really interesting dichotomy or juxtaposition from like what really is the beginning of this system between awareness, advertising, lack of budget, like is that the place to start? Or is it really the underemployment as the place to start? So it was very fascinating to see the differences and a little bit of the dance, but also some arm wrestling of where is it really going to go? So, and I think even though we didn't fully combine what we wanted to do, I think just stepping back, observing, and helping to facilitate, that I think we got a better awareness of like, I hadn't thought of that perspective, or I hadn't thought of it this way, or, ooh, there's some commonalities. How do we bring this back together?
With the data we had, I found that there's just more questions or hypotheses to prove out. Like we started creating assumptions. It was like, is that real or is that just what we think?
Yeah, which is a great outcome of an exercise like this. And obviously, I mean, people spend multiple months on these, right? And in these kinds of conversations, ultimately get to, I mean, Dirk's map is a starting point. If he were to share other iterations, I mean, multiple months there, but then that's a powerful way for a group to move forward. And that's a really powerful outcome there. Wow, we don't know about that. We need to know more. Okay, let's go out and talk with some more folks. It again surfaces that gap in a way that until that was out there, wouldn't have been apparent.
Yeah, absolutely, it starts the inquiry. It gives direction on where to inquire further, right? And not just, again, to those mental models, think that now you've mapped the truth, because it hasn't. So if you identify additional questions, that's amazing. And to the point of where does it start, one of the core things of a system map is it doesn't really matter where it starts. It doesn't matter. When it's mapped and you see the correlation, wherever, it's all interconnected anyway. So it's just as an extra add-on.
Something that really surprised me was I started to get really wedded to the model that I was working on. And then when we had to join, most recently, the whole table, I was like, no, like, don't cave, Phil, that's the right one. And I was like, I thought I was kind of an evolved human being, but it kind of surprised me, and it took me back to the quote that you had about it's more important to find the truth than to be right. And I'm still struggling with that right now, because it really blew me away that I experienced this. I'm just curious if other people had that too.
It's bringing us full circle. Thank you for sharing. It's bringing us full circle to our work with Leah this morning, right? In a lot of ways, as to what truths, how tightly we hold on to them. What does that mean about the different systems within us, right? Other teams would love it. Yeah, Leah.
Well, just on that point, you know, it was a growing of the system in the group. So it started out with 2, and then we had going back to what Anne said. You know, you had maybe your attachment of the pair, and then the 4, and then to the whole table, and yeah, it's an interesting exercise of looking at the system, and then being a part of a system trying to solve. Or trying to, you know, notice the differences and the differences of perspectives and not holding on too tightly.
Which, whether we have or recognize it or not, we're kind of doing that every day in our companies and our organizations. We just are doing it with oftentimes some pretty blunt tools and hurting a lot of people in the process, right? So this just surfaces it in a way that can be more constructive. Others?
I was going to add on that when we were merging the 4 of us, we said, oh, well, we still have a gap. But it was when we brought the 8 together, we were like, you filled the gap. So
Cool. There was, here from a...
Okay, so I had the challenge to facilitate our table. Good reframe.
So we had the cool table, that was the challenging table, we got the...
So what I noticed is that in terms of the elements in the system, we were almost identical, the 2 different groups. So I thought, okay, that's a good starting place. Then, though, the relationship that the 2 groups of 4 had identified well, we didn't have a lot of time to actually process how similar or dissimilar the relationships were. But they definitely weren't as similar as the elements were. And then, to Anne's point about wanting to be right or wanting to find the truth, I mean, I think our group was a little quick to gloss over the differences and just say, oh, it's pretty much the same. Which I think wasn't like a deep commitment to finding the truth of the system, you know? So.
Was that a little shade there? Was that a little, that sounded like a little shade that was.
I wrote that as a facilitator because that was what I was hearing them say. I'm not necessarily endorsing that, though.
Or we said because they're so similar, just pick one because they're both right. So we'll just pick which one we were going to present as our map.
Which I think is another good reminder here of not losing sight of the verb for the noun, right? Because in that example, you choose one, you're going to follow that verb through, and if you're truly seeking, at the end of the day, the truth, you'll bring back in those other pieces, right? So again, don't confuse the verb for the noun there. Yeah.
Yeah, I will probably just echo some of the comments you've heard. I've heard some labels for tables, and you know, I do have a label over here as well. We have a lot of enthusiasm, and the great thing about being with a lot of design thinkers is the willingness to share ideas. So I'm going to call us the fun table. So
Perfect.
we want to come over here for some fun in building some systems, and really that's kind of I think what we had in really seeing the connections evolve, and I think I kind of heard that throughout. But it's really seeing the different connections between the different pieces and hearing the different perspectives and seeing how connections that you may have missed or didn't know were there are suddenly come up. And so the system ended up changing and combining in a way that we think overall, you know, improved and gave a good overview of what we were looking at.
Cool. I'm looking at our time here, and we're just a minute over, just a minute or two over. So a couple of things. This isn't the end, obviously, in 90 minutes to have completely figured it out. That was, I always tell folks in my sessions, this is a launch, Okay, if you come thinking that this is the end, you're going to be disappointed. So, let's get real about what we're able to do if we're actually going to tackle things in the ways that we need to. Hopefully, you're starting to see some ways to build some truth into the complex systems that you are a part of each day, and that you can take a lot of what emerged in this space into further building to the truths and solutions into our work for tomorrow. So thank you for your willingness to dive in and to seek that truth with each other, to develop this very scarce but important resource.